So this is one of my favorite ethnic instruments. This is the Middle Eastern oud, which is one of the oldest ancestors of the guitar, and it is the ancestor of the lute.
You're hearing my guest today as he performs one of his over 200 instruments that he owns. We're going to talk about how to learn different instruments, but also how to collect them on a budget. And that's coming up next. Hello and welcome to episode number 32 of the Musician Toolkit. My name is David Lane, and it is great to be with you once again. One of the tools that I've talked about before, actually more than once on this podcast already, that every great musician should have is experience with other instruments. And there are two questions you would be justified in asking. One is, where can I find these instruments? And two, if I'm on a limited budget, how can I afford them? Well, these are two questions that Eric Perrotti has asked and answered well enough to have a collection of over 200 instruments, and he's done it without breaking the bank. So Eric is a bit of a special guest, given that I have known him not only for a while, I've known him for 23 years, but I've actually worked right next to him for probably at least the last 15 years at the current location where we both teach, and that's in person, that's at Jackson's Music in Winston-Salem. He is my next door neighbor in studio, and we're going to talk a little bit about that as we have our conversation. But Eric is comfortable in many genres. He primarily plays guitar, but he has a number of string instruments that he likes to present once a week with practically no repeat on his Instagram channel. All of this we're going to talk about and more. So let's go ahead and get to our conversation. This is my conversation with Eric Perrotti. So I'm really pleased today to be talking to Eric. Eric is undoubtedly, I don't think I could ever have a guest on this podcast that I'm closer to, and I mean that literally. Literally. About 10 hours a day, I would say we're within about 10 feet of each other.
We share a very thin wall between our studios.
Yes. So you're in your studio right now. You're probably not seeing this, but unless you're watching one of the promo clips. But on the other side of that wall is where I teach when I teach my in-person lessons. This is actually where I teach my online lessons in my home studio. And I first met you, Eric, 23 years ago, so it was in the year 2000. I'm pretty sure might have been 1999.
It was either 99 or 2000. That's right. Yeah.
During my very brief time that when I was way too young, I was given some authority to make decisions regarding new teachers, or at least to have an input. I don't think I had final say, but I was asked to kind of give a strong first impression and so forth. And of course, you came in saying, I think you were really looking for space at the time. We were in the mall, and you were like, just put me in the corner of a storage room. I don't care.
That's literally what I said. Yeah. And I think, I came with a pretty good collection of students, and but really it was because you put the word in for me. And I don't know if I've ever told you how much I appreciated that.
Well, I don't know how much stood out in the interview, but, during the brief time that you were at our first location in the mall, three things stood out to me that I would say has stood out still. One is that you have, as a teacher, you have definitely a passion. You have a way of almost getting your students excited to learn, which I find really, really admirable. The second thing that I noticed was that I couldn't really classify you as a type of guitarist. Like, I knew that you had a School of the Arts background, so of course you had a classical background. But I knew that you taught rock guitar to all the guitar students who wanted to learn that. And when I would hear you play, you were almost always playing jazz, at least early on. That was kind of how you spent your day.
Very confusing, and I still am.
Right.
Yeah.
But then the third thing I noticed was I'd never met anybody who really was serious about the ukulele. Now I think that was during a time when the ukulele might have been starting to take off. You got the famous version of Over the Rainbow, and and then people started picking it up, which is probably good for you as one of the few ukulele teachers.
Most of my uke students back then were converts who played guitar, and it was me begging them. And I'd have to tell them where they could find ukulele because, as you recall, working in music stores, they were never there really until maybe a little more than a decade ago. You would see no ukuleles in stores. So it was hard.
Right. And then I learned through, when you started posting on Instagram a few years ago, once a week, that, it's not just ukulele. You've got tons of instruments. I mean, you've got a ton of guitars, but you also have a bunch of string instruments, and then all of a sudden you start playing tin whistle or recorder or some other things. So this is what I kind of want to talk about today. So, you excel at three of the tools that I talk about, which is, I think teaching is a tool. I think familiarity with a lot of genres is a tool for a well-rounded musician, but learning other instruments is a tool. And specifically what I want to talk about today is, we're going to kind of lead into it, but I want to talk about where do you get these instruments? Because, one of the things I think if I'm talking to listeners about, you should get familiar with more instruments, I imagine pushback might be, well, it must be nice if you have money and, a lot of money, you can go do that. Well, I feel very confident. I'm not going to ask for a salary figure, but I know what I make, and I know that you're in a similar boat to me. So not that we're in poverty. So definitely, you have found ways to not let any financial situation impede you from just collecting a huge amount of instruments. So I guess we should go back a little bit. What do you identify as your primary instrument? Is it the guitar? And when did you first start playing? And what kind of style really got you into the guitar?
Right. Well, definitely was the guitar. And I would say it's still a primary instrument. I think I'm almost as equal on ukulele, except that, because intervallically, the ukulele and the guitar share a lot of the same intervals. That is to say, the first four strings of a guitar. The only difference is, aside from the ukulele usually being tuned a fourth above that, like if you put a capo on the fifth fret, it's reentrant tuning. So the fourth string is actually higher in pitch than the third, but you can still treat it the same way as you would the first four strings of a guitar. So in some ways, I think that I feel as comfortable on both instruments, but yeah, I would have to say the guitar. And I think my passion for that, it goes way back to childhood. I literally began playing at 8 years old, and I was banging on it and I was hearing things and my ear was telling me where to go. And somebody showed me a few chords. And one day my brother says, he picks up these 3 guitar do-it-yourself books, like Mel Bay books, 20, 30-page books. And he says, why don't you really learn how to play that thing? And he threw these books at me. And I remember going through all 3 of them in the summer because I didn't know you could do that. And here was this valuable information that I had. And by the end of that summer, I felt like I probably knew 20 chords, maybe 30 chords. I wasn't sure what instrument I would start on when I was little. I think I gravitated toward drums, but I never had a drum. I think maybe it looked like a great way to take out your frustrations if you really didn't understand musicianship, that you could beat on these things, but that's not really playing the drums. I think what I loved about the guitar was its harmonic and its melodic expressive abilities, because you could bend notes to gliss between the absolute microtones of the frets. And that was really interesting to me, that it was very expressive. But I think that passion fell into jazz. When we moved here from New York, I was a lost soul, and suddenly I had nothing to do. If you came from Queens, New York, and it was very active, and we lived in the countryside of Kernersville, before, this would have been in like late 70s. And so my parents signed me up for guitar lessons, and I had this desire to be completely self-taught. I wanted to be self-sufficient. and then it occurred to me, why do I want to be musically illiterate? But my first teacher was this amazing guy that I think is still in Winston-Salem. His name is Herb Stevens. And I met him, he was in his early 20s, and he was an open book. He was a jazz artist. I had no idea what jazz was. And that's just his format. And being with him for a couple of years, I had the opportunity to tell him about 3 or 4 years ago when he was in the store that of all the places I've been, he's still the most influential to me. Nice. When you're young too, and your mentor happens to be that first person. But that's where I started to understand how much I would love jazz. I loved its daringness to be harmonically different and abstract. I loved that. Like, you could take a few notes and put them together. And I didn't know if I really loved the chords he was playing at first, but I couldn't imagine how he was getting those notes to sound like that. So so I feel more at home in jazz, even though I don't have formal education in jazz. My formal education, as you said, definitely is classical guitar, classical music. I never felt quite at home there. I love it, but it was never the passion for me as jazz would be. But, when you're a kid and you're 12 and 13, of course I was playing Black Sabbath. I was like a metalhead at that point too. Yeah. So classical sounded cool to me because I think that's a bigger influence for young people who really like harmonic minor scales and things like that, right? So, yeah. So there you go. Guitar is my main instrument.
So when did you start exploring other instruments? Was ukulele the first, or did you have some other instruments besides the guitar that you picked up before then?
Well, definitely bass, but I knew enough about bass to then say, okay, so it's the same as the last 4 strings on a guitar, same exact intervals, an octave lower. So I knew I could play that. So I talked my brother into getting one, knowing he would never play it. And so I figured that I would have a bass in the house. That was a no-brainer. But I remember one year my parents didn't know what to get me for my birthday, and they surprised me with a mandolin. They just assumed I would know what to do with it. And again, this is what occurred to me at a really early age. If you knew how the instrument was tuned, you could theoretically walk your way across it. But I think there's a spell that comes over most guitarists anyways. We really, as you mentioned from my Instagram posts, we think we can play every instrument. It's this weird mentality. And I don't know why I still believe that, because I've listened to some of those Instagram videos and I should never pick up a violin, but I can promise you I'll probably do it again.
Nice. I'm just going to take the bass and the guitar and the ukulele to present what I would think is an obvious challenge. And I'm not going to, I shouldn't say that I know I picked up all 3 of those instruments. And that is, yes, they're all string instruments. They all have vastly different hand stretches. And, so getting used to that. Now, I imagine maybe that's not quite the same when you can see the frets. It's maybe not quite the same as trying to go from cello to the violin or something like that. But how do you find that adjustment difficult, or do you just have to practice? The stereotype is it's harder to go from big to small than small to big, but I don't know if you think that's true or not.
I think it's true. I think it's also true the other way, but not quite as much. Because when I have been playing guitar for a few hours and pick up a ukulele, my judgment is too big, and it's weird. I could get to the 7th fret where my brain was thinking it was only the 3rd,
Yeah.
But I think the adjustment's quick. If I highly recommend rotating, even as a guitarist. I have over 100 guitars, and I love to play on the ones that mean the most because maybe they're the home base for me, but I more so love rotating them around and not getting too used to any one of them so that you don't fall into a pit that you can't get out of. You need to expand your comfort zone by getting uncomfortable a little bit,
Right.
Yeah.
So do you have a count of how many instruments you own?
No, but let's say it's easily over 200, easily. Wow. But that's including everything. Some of the stupid little penny whistles, and I have a few nice recorders, by the way. Right. But I told myself that I don't need to buy another recorder, but I probably will.
Okay, so let's just maybe, we won't go through all 200, but maybe just kind of pick a half dozen maybe of like some interesting ways you've obtained instruments. Now, I think if I remember correctly, I mean, my memory, this is probably going back to a 20-year conversation, but I seem to remember that you would sometimes go into a flea market or something. Yeah. So have you found many good instruments that way?
I would say one of the first instruments that ever started my craze in a particular direction was definitely at a flea market. But I'm also a Beatles fanatic, although I can't think when the last time was I listened to a Beatles album. I've played those for 30 or 40 years. There's more music to hear now, but in my formative years, it was very much Beatley. And, the song Back in the USSR, what is he saying? So one day I figure out he says something about the instrument, the balalaika.
Yeah.
And I find out what that is, and I think to myself, wow, that's a Russian instrument. I will never find one of those. But I actually have two of them. And about 30 plus years ago, I came across one at a flea market in Yadkinville. And I think the guy wanted $30 for it. And he said, it's Chinese. And I said, no, that's a Russian balalaika. And not only that, it even had a little pamphlet with it, which was a big plus. Mm-hmm. Tiny little pamphlet, all in Russian. But one thing is beautiful, the universal language of music, and in particular, the common written music notation. Because what I saw appeared to be E, up a fourth A, and the same A again. I thought, well, that must be how you tune it. And so I drew this conclusion. If you know how an instrument is tuned, again, I said that earlier, I believe, you could start making your way across the fingerboard. You just got to keep using your theory. Nothing really changes except you got to know where your starting points are. So I started playing that thing, and then I let that go for many years. And then I realized, what if you don't want to tune it that way? It really doesn't matter. You can tune it however you want. But I do normally use that tuning, the EAA tuning, like up a fourth. And that works out pretty good if you want to sound Russian. But I remember one time playing it in a restaurant, and there happened to be a Russian guy there, and he took great interest in the fact that I was playing this balalaika. And I said, I was playing like a medieval style music because it was a medieval restaurant, and it sounded pretty neat. I was actually playing an old, it might have been Sumeris Ekumenin or something like that, And he was smiling, and I said, I don't really know any Russian music, though. And he goes, no, you don't. Right away that I was playing this as a non-Russian cultural musician, but he appreciated it at the same time,
Right.
So that's kind of where that craze started. And it definitely was found at a flea market.
Right. Balalaika is probably its most endearing mark is probably its use in the film score for Dr. Zhivago.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah. But there is a great group. My wife Jennifer heard them come to her area in Florida when she lived there. It was a balalaika orchestra. They had like a bass balalaika and so forth, and she said they were phenomenal.
Yeah, the basses are nearly as big as an upright concert bass. They may be a little shorter. I've never seen one in person. But there's also a piccolo, which is a tiny little balalaika. The two that I have are both the common size. Which I don't know what voicing that is. It might be a soprano voicing. It's a high voicing. I got to tell you, that instrument, they never intonate that well. And I don't know if you remember Paulina Rabdel, who used to teach at Jackson's.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And she told me that was common, that the intonation's usually a little off with those. But she also suggested that most players only chant on the bottom, or the little string, and the other two are often played as a drone. I don't know how common that really is. But that instrument has become so useful to me. I've used it on a lot of my Christmas albums. It's almost a go-to. It has this great sound that it's not a mandolin. You just know it. And it has this tiny little central hole. And it really projects very well, though. That's just been I think because it doesn't feel that unlike a Western instrument,
Yeah. Now, there are some instruments, I assume that you probably have a dulcimer or two in your collection. Is that true?
I had to. I got rid of one recently. But yeah, I have a lap dulcimer that my dad made for me many, many years ago. And I decided of the two that I had, that one meant more to me. And it's very functional. I've used that to record with as well. The dulcimer is really neat, too, because it's diatonically fretted. Yeah. And depending upon how you have it tuned, it'll accommodate different modal tunings based on the starting point. But as long as you stay on the chanter string, which would normally be the one closest to you, sometimes played as a chorus in double. The others you normally just play open. If you're really good, you'll start fretting all the strings to create differences in voicings for chords. But you can't go wrong if you just play that one chanter string. Everything will work.
Yeah, that was the point that I was gonna draw. Is that most of your string instruments are chromatic, but the dulcimer and the harp are the two that come to mind that are modal instruments, and they only have 7 letters, and depending on how you tune it, and it seems like, if I remember correctly, like a lot of dulcimers they're happiest in the key of D, but it's like the standard tuning or something like that. But as you say, you can change the tuning on these things to get what you want.
That's what I do, especially with the dulcimer, is when I'm recording with that, I just decide upon what open string pitches I think sound best with what I'm recording, or it might even start from the dulcimer. I haven't used it a whole lot, but I have used that, every here and there. And again, that one, it's got this real nasally, drony sound, so it's easy to pick out on a recording. And some people have compared the sound of a lap dulcimer to a bagpipe because of the drone pipes on the bagpipe.
Okay, so I know one other way that you have obtained instruments for sure. And that is that you've had the fortune of having a lot of students over the years who, I guess they just know you like instruments, and they've given you some as gifts. So what's one or two of the most interesting instruments that you've gotten by receiving it as a gift?
Well, actually, the guy who teaches piano next to me, wait, that's you. His wife gave me some really cool ones. I love that Dombra from Kazakhstan, which is pretty neat. It's a lot like an instrument I already had called the dutar. I believe it's a dutar. The dutar is Turkish, but it's a smaller version of a very, very similar instrument with old world frets that are tied completely around the neck of the instrument. But they play a lot like a guitar, as far as they're just in half steps. But to that point, aside from things like that, of those two instruments, I would say it's any variety of things. One of them was one of my balalaikas that one of my students was going to relocate to Texas. His family was moving, and his mom handed me this thing. And it's not very playable, but I intend to one day put that in playing condition. But it was really beautiful because some of the balalaikas have a black face, and they have painting on them of Russian scenery, and this was one of those. So I keep it on display in my home studio. That was a really, really neat piece. But that's how you can maintain a lot of instruments. I tell my students this all the time. Then they say, how do you get so many guitars? Well, first of all, just always offer $20 because you're mostly going to get laughed at when people hear that. But sometimes they'll go, yeah, that's fine. Or they might say, how about 25? And if it means enough to you, you'll probably spring for the 25. But if people know you collect, they hand them to you constantly. It may take a while, but a couple of years ago, pre-pandemic, a student of mine that is actually a ukulele student, she's got a small but exquisite little collection. She has a 1920 Martin. Her dad bought these for her, and he goes to estate sales, and she came in with a little holy grail for me. It was a mid-1950s, made by Harmony, Roy Smeck concert uke in exquisite condition. And she said, I don't really collect them, and I know you've mentioned this guy's name. And she just handed it to me, and I couldn't believe that. And a few other ukuleles that people have given me over the years. Honestly, they don't know what to do with them. I remember when we had another guitar teacher here, and he said, I'm cleaning out my closets at home. If I find anything you might want, what would you want me to look for? And I said, how about a ukulele? And wouldn't you know, he came in the next day with one. A neat little old uke, again, probably a 60, 70-year-old ukulele that needed some repair, but it's still on the shelf waiting to be repaired. Nice. But, actually, the flea markets also, I call it treasure hunting when I go to thrift stores. But one of the strangest things I found, there's a Goodwill, and I shouldn't be saying this. People are going to find my wishing hole on Peters Creek. And I was digging through the bins there last year, and I come across, it was a gig bag. Now I go, I wonder what could be in here, and I unzip it. This was a Persian Comanche. I never thought I'd see this. It's a gourd body, and it's a spike fiddle played straight up on the knee with a fiddle that sometimes goes in between the strings. And it was all there. And I take it up front where everything is sold by weight, and I think it was less than $5. So, even though I can't do much with it, just owning it is the greatest feeling,
Right.
That, and actually in the same place a few years back, there's a guy there that sees me all the time, and he comes walking over to me with a favila ukulele that's an oval shaped uke made in Italy. And they went out of business, I think, in the 1940s. And he goes, "Look what I found." Now he was down on his luck, and he said, "If I go buy it, would you give me $20 for it?" And I said, "Why don't I just give you 20 right now, and I'll go buy it?" So it wound up costing me about another $2 above the 20, you know. So
Right.
yeah, so that was a fun find right there. But you know, that's how I obtain these. But really, every one of them comes with the intention to be played,
Right.
to whatever extent it might be. Now we have a cousin that is married to a guy from Pakistan, and when they went to their honeymoon in Pakistan, he came back with, I don't know if it's truly a sarangi. It's the Pakistani version of a sarangi that he said was completely authentic, which again is an upward held fiddle that you play this way with with a bow, and play it on your knee, and that's a neat thing. So that was just given to me. You know, they knew I loved instruments, and so there was that.
Nice. You mentioned thrift stores, and I haven't said this to too many people, but for those who have seen any of my videos, I have a piano off to my left here that I use for this studio, and I got that at a Salvation Army before that particular location closed. I went there looking for another piano. People, my in-laws said, we saw a piano at the Salvation Army. You got to go check it out. And they wanted me to look at it because it was really beautiful. It was mahogany. It was polished. It was so nice. But all you had to do is play two notes and just know this thing is awful. You look inside, the pins are rusty, and it was like it would take so many tunings. I'm like, this isn't worth it. I think it was $500, something like that is what they wanted. And then right next to it, they had this piano for $100. And the wood is chipped right here. There's another side to it. It just doesn't look very good. It's big and bulky, but it was almost in tune. All the keys played, and I said one or two tunings, and this thing is good to go. It was $110 bench included, and
wow.
And so, for those who don't know, that's a very good price for any piano at all. So.
Yeah, absolutely. That is something, and I've learned that about thrift stores, is they don't have a clue. They probably looked at the other one and thought, well, this one's got to be worth more because it's prettier, and they don't know anything about the functionality of the instrument,
Yeah, and that was nearly 20 years ago. I've had this for a very long time. It's been in, I think, 3 different rooms in this house, and it holds its tune really well. I don't feel like I have to tune it, more than any other piano I have, so...
But if you had the other one, that's the thing. If I buy instruments that I know they need repair, almost all of the time I know I can do the repair. But it's a guitar, it's a banjo, it's a ukulele. They're far easier to evaluate and to repair than that piano would have been. I don't know what you would have had to replace on that. Probably all the strings inside, I would think, would need to be taken out and put new ones in. What would that cost?
Right.
Yeah.
So you've gone over learning strategies for string instruments, figure out how it's tuned, figure out how the strings relate to each other, learn the chords. But you obviously know some non-stringed instruments. We mentioned recorder, like tin whistle. What are some of the non-string instruments, and how did you, in your mind, go about learning to play it?
That's really good because, again, I'm going way back into the 90s when I started thinking about branching out and at least having a fairly good comprehension of what it's like to get away from the guitar, because really, music theory applies to every instrument, well, at least every Western instrument. So I wanted to experience that, as you say, about looking at an alternate instrument. With tin whistle, the first thing I did was tell myself, learn to read on it. Mm-hmm. So that I could comprehend, the movement of the notes, the contour of the notes, how far my fingers had to go to make intervals. Now, that also would require technique beyond my fingering to play whistle or recorder, because you have to blow harder to get to another octave. But that was my mentality. I'm still close to 30 years ago when I would do that. And I remember getting pretty good at reading for those instruments. Then I would realize, I could improv on them as well. And that's kind of where I take those now, as opposed to always reading on them. But weird thing happened. I got a new ukulele student today. He's 7 years old. I would never teach a ukulele student how to read notation. It's highly impractical because the first and fourth string are tuned to almost the same pitch. So it's a real game of guessing to determine where you're going to place certain notes, which string. So that's confusing. But his first teacher had only taught him how to do that. So he was reading these little melodies. That was all well and fine. I told him not to stop doing that. But you got to learn the technique of your instrument as well. And the ukulele can play melodies, but it's really a perception that tells us that it's really a chordal instrument. So I think that's important too. If I'm playing a stringed instrument, is that I've already learned the basic technique from a guitar on how to use my left hand so that it doesn't interfere with adjacent strings. But if you're just playing melody, that's not going to matter. You know, the technique can be very sloppy if you're just playing melody and still get a pretty good tone from string to string. But I think that's why I think approaching other stringed instruments is easy. And that made too much sense to me when I was younger. So I wanted to try things that were not with strings. So the recorders, I think when I was at the School of the Arts, I really didn't love 20th century classical guitar music. And I wasn't quite in love with Spanish guitar. I really liked Renaissance music. And I was always told, well, you know, you're supposed to graduate away from that. I was like, well, then why do people make careers out of it? You know, right? Why was there a Julian Bream who was a great classical guitarist, but also a great lutenist? So I wanted to play recorder because I really loved the sound of it. It's oddly nasal. You know, the recorder is a funky tone. It bothers many people's ears. But I wanted to read for that. So I used to be able to read for recorder really well. I mean, beyond just basic fingering, I was learning how to read in different keys. And I remember recording a lot of Renaissance music 20 some odd years ago that I felt that confident that I could do that. I don't read for that instrument so much anymore, but I think that's just another way to expand your musical brain, is to not settle in just one place. You know, it's like trying different recipes and opening up your musical palette beyond just the instrument, but realizing that the music theory applies to all of them, right?
Right.
Yeah.
So I know that we could go on, I mean, you know, there's still, 194 instruments to go.
So we've only gotten a few there.
Yeah. So maybe just some takeaways, just before we go on to the next topic, and that is, so have a budget when you're looking for instruments. Try places like flea markets, in yard sales, and I guess there's estate sales. I don't know how people find out about those anymore, but I guess you could find out about them some places. It used to be in the paper when papers were more prevalent, but have just a budget in mind for it, and go ahead and just offer. And also, as you make friends and you have students and you meet and you have family, let it be known that you like instruments, and you never know who might give you some gifts. So I would say that sounds like the strategy for getting the instruments. And then for learning the instruments, it's just being patient with, just figuring out how the instrument works and learning. And probably, it sounds like, don't try to learn the repertoire right away. Try to learn how the instrument works and figure out just some technique on it, and then you can make the music. Does that sound kind of accurate?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And I will admit some of the things that I have, I've recorded with. Like, an instrument that I really love, but I hardly ever touch anymore, is a Chinese erhu. And I found that at an antique festival, and it was on a rainy day. And I wander into this booth, and it was these two people from China, and they had the most exquisite antiques. Their stuff was like 500 and 600 years old. And they were a bit appalled at what they were seeing that was like 50-year-old stuff that they did not think was antique. So I see this erhu hanging, and I go, oh, that's an erhu. Now, not only that, I told them that I was going to be going to China soon to become a father.
Right.
And so immediately they take to me. I think they dropped the price of that thing from $150 to $35, just because I took interest in that. And she told me it was from the 19th century. That, again, is a spike fiddle. The erhu is really neat. It's a 2-string spike fiddle that the bow is supposed to be entwined between the 2 strings, and it's permanently there until you take the strings off. I did wind up recording with that, and I would love for you to hear it because I think it sounds like soundtrack music. But anyway, It took forever to put down a line and punch in, because there's no way to really determine where your pitches are except by ear. You don't depress the string, you just touch it. And it's about an inch away from the neck itself. The string is above that. And, you move the bow this way. It's really unusual, parallel to the floor. And you hold the instrument straight up. That took a lot of takes for me to get one line and then another and then another. And, you edit it together and nobody can tell you did that. At least, you hope that. Right. But I don't know if that was answering your question yet, though.
No. So just having a strategy, of like learning, kind of figuring out each instrument, but also getting them. So I'm going to direct listeners to your Instagram. It is one word, Eric Perrotti, the handle, right. and that is 2 R's, 2 T's. And I was just checking. You have 352 posts. I don't know if those are all videos or I know they're at least mostly videos. Have you ever repeated an instrument in those posts?
Rarely, and I'm about to do that this weekend because it has been more than 3 years. And believe it or not, it's going to be a sitar post. But it's the last time I did a sitar post, again, was more than 3 years ago. And, I try to make them kind of funny. I'm sitting there with a little tabla drum in front of me that I'm not playing, and this and that, and wearing something that I thought looked a little Indian, not trying to be out of taste though. And I played a raga, which that's an interesting thing too. I think with that balalaika I mentioned earlier, that started my craze of wanting to find cultural instruments. Mm-hmm. And when I found this sitar, which is it's a smaller body sitar, it was like finding a gift from God. I couldn't believe this was actually at a store that used to be on Reynolda Road called the World Mission Shop, and it was made in India. It was $150. I couldn't believe it. But when I posted it last time, I played a raga. A raga, we mistakenly call it a scale, mm-hmm. but it's really, the Indian culture would say, don't call it a scale, even though they actually use the same modes we do. They may not use the term, for example, Ionian, but they do use a major scale in their work as well as we do. But they say, call it a tone row, because the ascension and the descension are different. And sometimes it's important to slur a note into the next during one passage as opposed to another. So I played a raga called Maro Bihag a few years ago, and I just improvised with it a little bit, because most Indian music is really just improvisation. But this post, I've already recorded it. They're short. This one might be a minute long though. I actually decided to get a recorded drum beat, let that go, and strum the sitar, yes. Which you don't do. You don't strum a sitar, but I'm strumming it to produce the overtone of harmony, drones, and which that happens anyway with sitar music. And that's what I did with that. As far as posting, a few of the instruments, that'll be only the second post in 4 years of the sitar. But, certain people may never have seen it because they don't search the page. There are a couple of guitars that I've done more than once. I try not to, because the whole idea started with featuring all of these instruments. And so to have rarely repeated any is a good example of, because I post every Saturday, usually around 1:30 in the morning, between 1:30 and 2. I found that that's a really cool thing. Create a brand for the way you do everything and let people expect it's going to be there. So I know there's a number of people that on Saturday morning will go, I bet he posted something, so it's almost like having a routine where if you tune in to see Seinfeld every Thursday night, you know what went on at 9 o'clock, right? So, right. So that's many years ago. But that's a good example of how many instruments I try to post, is not repeating them that often. But yes, there have been a few. And you asked another question as far as, are they all videos? What was it, about 352? Is that?
I think it says you have 352 posts, and that doesn't say if you archived any of them or deleted any, but that's what you have right now. So now we're recording this a little early, so it'll probably be like 354 by the time this comes out.
That's right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, at least 354. I think maybe of the 352, 350 are videos.
Right.
I know I put a couple of photos on there of an instrument here. Maybe three of them are photos as opposed to videos. I like doing the videos. It's a really fun thing to do, and people comment sometimes, "Hey, I had one of those guitars," and or just they like what I'm playing. It's just fun.
Yeah. And I like it. There's a little framing device that you do with each video I like, and you start with a close up of the instrument, pull back, play it, and then you show the close up again as you stop the video. So it's always kind of fun, and it's something you kind of come to expect. If people find those videos, and they're like, you seem like a very interesting person, they want to take lessons with you. I know if you live in Winston-Salem, certainly they should look you up. You currently you're teaching at Jackson's Music and on Stratford Road, and but you still take online students, right?
Very rarely, but I did pick up another one about a month and a half ago. Yeah.
Okay. So anywhere in the world, if you if you'd like to, if you have to check with Eric, just send him a direct message.
That almost happened, though. I've got to tell you this. So there was a kid I taught years ago. He was about 14, 15, and nobody wanted to take this kid. They all called him the wild boy. Mm-hmm. And I got along with him just fine. He was wild. He would come down in this location on his skateboard, and he was kind of noisy and, real street urchin type of thing. Yeah, but we got along really good. And he took from me for about 2 years. And then we parted, and I would see him every now and then. When I came back here after quarantine, he looked me up. Now, I want to tell you, I met him in the 80s. He looked me up, wanted to take lessons again. Now he was 50. And that's the coolest thing. But he had been living in China. Everybody said he would never mount anything. He actually, I think, has a PhD, but he teaches English as a second language, and he's taught all over the world. And he loves to be in other countries, experience the culture, but he loves China. And particularly likes to be in Taiwan. And so he told me straight up, he said, "I'm so glad we can do this." He said, "I'm going to be going back to China probably in about 5 months." So we planned to do this, through Zoom, because it's a 12-hour difference. It could have been like, how about 8 a.m. for you, 8 p.m. for me? That we could do that, but we just never got it together. But that would have been really cool. I think that I do have a few people that are further away from here. I was teaching a kid in Charlotte, so that's not too far, but it was cool. It was really, because I had taught his grandfather for 30 years. So this was, when I first started teaching his grandfather, his daughter was this kid's age. So he's about 14, so pretty neat.
All right. So this is going to come out toward the end of July, and when we get to August, you're going to be doing, once again, something called Jackson's Jams. Why don't you tell us a little bit about it, what it is, and if anyone wants to get on board, how they can do that?
Sure. Yeah. So Jackson's Jams, I think we probably started around 15 years ago. I was not even on the board when that started, but I heard about it. And another teacher that was really supposed to be doing Jackson's Jams asked me if I would be interested, and I said, I'll volunteer my time. I'd love to see what it's about. Well, we didn't have a game plan yet. It was just a bunch of kids sitting around in a circle, and kind of like a workshop where you'd try to get them to play scales to a metronome. But it seemed really boring. So what we decided to do was, how about they learn to write music? So the format is, it's a 2-week day camp. We go from 9 a.m. to 1:30. And week one, or let's say day one, if I got enough kids, I'll break them up into about 2 or 3 different bands and see who works well together. And we want to, on day one, immediately start writing a song, each band. Last year, we only had one band. So we start writing something, and I want to draw the ideas from the kids. So the first thing was, does anybody have any ideas? And then we sort of nurture that. We work with it. I want everybody to give it input. Even if the input is really small, it'll be meaningful in the end. It'll be a very important part. So week one is acclamation, writing the songs, taking direction, because I always let everybody know that I'm the director. Mm-hmm. Everybody's opinion matters. Mine's the only one that counts, but usually their opinions are the ones that are always used, because I want them to feel that important, because they are. We have to name the bands. And so They have to do that. By the end of week one, I want the songs to be in fairly a completed stage because we're going to record them. So we do the recordings on Friday and maybe the following Monday. So that's got to get done. Week two, they will take photographs of their bands. They have to name their songs. They have to name their bands. They have to decide who's going to be the person that speaks on stage, because at the end of week two, they do a free show upstairs in the showroom. Usually it's about 30 minutes. And so they've had to work out this show. So the second week is a lot of drilling for the show. Recording's over, photos are done. We take a good 3 days, 4 days, and really drill the show. And on the final Friday, we move all our equipment upstairs for the last hour of rehearsal so they can acclimate to the stage. And so that night, around 6 o'clock, they have to do their advertising, tell all your friends. We have a big show. And last year we had 4 kids and they packed the place. We didn't have enough chairs. It was great. When it's all over, I shove them into a limousine and we go eat pizza and tool around town like rock stars. And by the end of the limo ride, which is usually we were out for about 3 hours just having fun, everything starts to get quiet and the kids start to look a little sad and they ask me if we're going to do it again next year.
Nice.
So yeah, if anybody wants to inquire, I could use probably another drummer. You could probably just contact Jackson's Music and ask about Jackson's Jams and find out pricing. We're going to start on July the 31st and it runs 2 weeks.
Okay. So this is for those local in Winston-Salem, but if you're listening to this and you're not local, but that sounds like a good time, there's no better time than to take a 2-week vacation to Winston-Salem, especially if you're a drummer, to join Jackson's Jam. So yeah, we'll go ahead and push that. Do you have any other projects or anything? I mean, we talked about where people can follow you on Instagram, and that's, as far as I know, like your only kind of social media hangout, unless I'm
yeah, I guess I'm on Facebook, but I never pay attention to it. I think what I like about the whole Instagram thing, it really seems like a sharing platform, and I rarely get people who just want to kind of be rude about what you're doing. Most people are very complimentary, or they at least leave you a little like, and it's all about sharing who you are and looking at others doing the same thing. And I feel it's like a little group hug, you know. Right. That's my take from it. Maybe not everybody feels that way, but I've had very positive reaction with Instagram, and I kind of got on accident. I had a student that told me to get on Instagram so I could see what they were posting on a regular basis. And I didn't post for a while. And then I thought, well, why not? Why am I not doing this? It sounds like fun. It seems like fun. And it has been. It's been really cool. But I guess I'm so absorbed in, it's funny that I've been teaching guitar for 40 years. And when it started out, I was kind of encouraged by my dad to do it. He said, you could set up a studio in the basement. And I said, okay, but I don't really want to do this too long. I'm only going to do Wednesday night and Sunday afternoon. And before I knew it, I had 10 or 15 students, and it was cool. It was pocket money. I was young and I didn't really need to pay bills, but I'm still doing it. And this thing that I thought was only going to be sort of a little muse for a while, and I'm still doing it. And, it really, you make these connections. And I often say that I think I'm a severely underpaid therapist, which is fine by me, because my people, I think they really feel that I care so much about them, Mm-hmm. Sometimes I'll have people that just need to talk for a while before we play. And if that's what this format means to them, then I'm honored to be there, to be that person, to be, I guess, a mentor from time to time. Did I just say that? Right. So I guess I'm more involved in this. And every year I force myself into a responsibility of making a Christmas album, and I think I've done maybe 15 or 16 of those. And it's like, because I need to be creative, mm-hmm. and I don't really have the time accessibility to do that because I'm always prepping for lessons. I want to write music, but if I can't do that as much, and I really do consider myself a composer, and they're in all the instruments, the more instruments I had, I felt like the more I could use those in my compositions and recordings, which I do in my Christmas albums. Which, by the way, they're never vocal. Right. So, which I could do that, but I don't. I think that would be a turnoff if somebody made a Christmas album and it was vocal, unless they were really truly a vocalist. Which mm-hmm. I can do that. I used to sing professionally, but I like to take these opportunities when I'm making a Christmas album to add some of the cultural instruments that I have. Like I have this oud that I really love, and the oud is one of the earliest ancestors of the guitar, a fretless Middle Eastern instrument. and I like incorporating that sound. And if you can make it sound authentic and still do a Christmas melody that maybe is a little hidden, that the listener has to try to find that melody in there, that to me is where my creativity probably sits for now, you know. So I don't perform live as much. I did tour around the country back in the old days with a band, and that was going places at one point, but it musically wasn't where I wanted to be. So I don't really crave that as much. I think I would love to do more live performance, but it's sort of not really in my schedule right now, you know?
Right. But yeah, I'm glad you mentioned the Christmas albums. That's definitely a tradition that I think I've only heard 2 of them, but you know, that's...
Oh, I got to get you more.
Okay.
Right?
All right.
Yeah.
Yeah. You know, it's a shame that this video is not going to be shared as is on YouTube, because the sun went down. It was actually all the way up when we started, and the sun went down. So I think I'm going to do like a time lapse of super fast speed of the whole interview, just to kind of show the way and learn more about music as you explore different instruments. So
honestly, I've almost never done the high end. I mean, very rarely do I ever buy that.
Right.
Yeah.
All right. Well, you know, this has been great. It's a long overdue conversation, but thanks so much for just sharing your insight today.
Well, thank you for taking interest in my strange compulsion to buy instruments, and thank you for having me on.
And that just about wraps up episode number 32. I would ask you, the listener, if you have found an incredible deal on an instrument, or you found it at a really interesting place, I'd love for you to tell me about it. What's the most interesting place that you've found a musical instrument where you weren't expecting it, or what's the best deal that you found on a new instrument? Naturally, you can send me a message on Instagram or Facebook, or you can go to my website. You can find the specific page for this website at davidlanemusic.com/toolkit and reach out with the contact form. But if you have a story, I would love it if you would share it with your own voice by leaving me a voice message at speakpipe.com/toolkit. If you have a studio of any kind and you would love to have an easier time with admin, such as keeping up with your schedule and also getting payments from your clients, from your students, this is of course for you music teachers, but also for yoga teachers, those who teach martial arts, and physical therapists, other kinds. It is really worth your while to check out Fonz, and you can do that with the link in my show notes. It is a free trial, no strings attached. Go ahead and check it out and see how it might free up some time and free up some stress with your business. Just a few reminders. If you enjoyed this episode, I would love it if you would do one or all of a few things. One, of course, probably the most important, is please share this episode with at least one friend. Send it as an email, as a text, or post it on social media. If you're streaming this on YouTube, please give it a thumbs up. And if you're listening to this podcast, especially on Apple Podcasts, I would be so honored if you would leave a 5-star rating and review. And that's going to do it for this week. I'm going to be back with you again next week with episode number 33. Until then, thank you so much for listening.